I'm a computer software programmer. I was actually writing my PhD in philosophy when the IBM PC came. I write software for academic research, and I talk to academics. Academics are users of the program. I write now and then, but I'm a developer trying to create research tools. My real passion is in justice. Outside of my work life, I've been engaged in trying to bring about justice in small ways in the world. I come from a Christian peace tradition where that matters. And in the last years, I've been active with groups called Release Aged People from Prison, Center for Community and Alternative, Restorative Justice. I mean, justice that doesn't just simply look at um, a perpetrator and a victim and treat them in isolation, and that doesn't just punish in perpetuity people for things that they've done, but instead tries to heal the harm, that people take accountability for what they did, restore relationships when possible with the victim, and mostly rebuild the communities and look at the communities from which they both came and try to heal those communities. It's not a model where we look at people who have done things that sometimes are really horrific, but act as though they are that person for the rest of their lives, the person who did that thing. And also, I mean, beyond that, of course, we also have people who have are incarcerated for things they didn't do. A good friend of mine, Greg Mingo, was released by Governor Cuomo after 40 years, serving 40 years for something he didn't do. And so we have people who have done terrible things who are inside. We have people who haven't done things but are still inside. And the thing that's really disturbing to me is this racial disparity. How is it possible that so many people behind bars in Westchester are people of color? The thing that has really bothered me is that even in our county, which we think is a very progressive county, um, over 90%, actually, according to the Vera Institute of Justice, 9.6% of the people convicted in our majority white Westchester County serving time in New York State prisons are people of color. And I find that even before George Floyd, but especially after it, that's really something that's extremely disturbing. And I wonder how we, this a county that imagines ourselves as progressive, can tolerate that. As part of my work, I've talked to Andrea Stewart Cousins personally and in formal roles. I go up to Albany to lobby, talk to senators, assembly people at the state level. And in going to Albany and talking about these things, lots of bills up there are worth talking about. But one of them, there's two of them actually, two parole reform bills, fair and timely parole and elder parole. And both these bills are really very modest. So it's just a chance to let people, mostly people of color, because the system has a legacy of racism, go before a parole board and not be automatically released, but just have a hearing to see if they are able to safely return to their community. Now, and our congressmen and our county executive, they don't have the vote on these issues. They have to be decisions made by the state, by the assembly people and legislative senators in the state. But what we need is to change the narrative that, whoa, if we just punish people, if we tear communities apart, we're safer. Like when somebody is incarcerated inside, we think about the person who is inside and the perpetrator, and we think, wow, they must be a terrible person. But we have to realize that for every person inside, studies show that there are at least 10 people outside who are impacted, children, spouses, grandparents, and so forth. And so the goal is not hold people responsible for what they've done, but when you see something happening, to try to find out why, and then to restore the communities from which everybody came, from which the victim came, from which the perpetrator came, and look at something not in an isolated manner, but in a holistic picture. I campaigned for George Latimer. I went door to door trying to get him elected. After the election night, he came, I went to celebrate, and he said, my people, let's talk. And over the course of the years, we've had various ongoing conversations. But finally, after realizing where we stood, that there were bills that could be brought to the floor for a vote and have enough votes to pass, if there were if our assembly people like Majority Leader Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins had the political sort of backing to do so, that they would pass. So I thought it's time to talk to George. So in January of 2023, I had an hour and a half private breakfast with George. And I talked about this issue. And George, I friendly, and George said, well, I'm term limited, and I think I'm going to go into public service. And he just seemed like a statesperson who was willing to talk about this. And so he said, look, I'm going to appoint a liaison in my office. And so that you can bring the names of 3 or 4 people to me who are impacted by this in Westchester, and we'll start talking about this issue. And so I thought, well, finally, we have somebody in the corridors of power who can help reshape the narrative that will give our state assembly and legislators the capacity, the backing to bring these bills to the floor for a vote. And these are just small steps toward restorative justice. They aren't the whole picture at all. Since that day, I've heard nothing. And I thought the time was ripe, because it wasn't just like, well, it's not time, because it was time, because the end of the legislative session was approaching, and these bills had majority commitments to vote in both houses, and we needed somebody to bring, to Andrea Stewart-Cousins the political backing to make it clear this wasn't just a group of marginal activists for whom this mattered, but it was a matter of safety and human flourishing to pass. So I gave George and Jamaal on Memorial Day in 2023 in Hastings-on-Hudson a letter that I had edited for impacted communities. And it was a simple one-page letter, very non-controversial. I think anybody would agree. And George said, I'll read it tonight and I'll get back to you. And Jamaal said the same thing. And again, personal conversations following up earlier personal conversations, in George's case, the hour and a half breakfast that I'd had with him. But since that day, I've heard nothing from George. In fact, I called his office, and they started putting me through people lower and lower on the chain, and eventually they ended up ghosting me. I even went to his office after not hearing from them to follow up on this commitment that he'd made, that he was going to say something about this, but they wouldn't even let me in the office because you couldn't go in the county executive's office anymore without having an appointment. But of course, they wouldn't even return the calls, so I couldn't get an appointment. It was like a classic catch-22. But it doesn't matter what he did to me. I mean, I don't care. But what matters is that if you're county executive in a county in which you have discovered, particularly post-George Floyd, that this kind of legacy of racism is existing, and say nothing, what does that say? It means that ultimately restorative justice, racial justice doesn't matter to you. I mean, George says that Jamaal won his first election because, black people voted after the death of George Floyd. I think that's appalling. We should have every voice vote, and we should have restorative justice. Restorative justice isn't just something for black and brown peoples. It's for all of us. It makes us all safer. And the fact that George wasn't willing to say anything, hasn't been willing to say anything. In fact, as I said, he hasn't talked to me since about these issues, despite 4 years of conversations about this and commitment to say something about this. And what changed, I think, was that in January, he was imagining a career of being an elder statesperson. But in June, he had a political gleam in his eye, because we know he was, AIPAC people were talking to him long before this. Now, one of the other tragedies in this is that what has happened in, the horrific attack by Hamas on October 7th, though we have to understand we want to look at stateless terrorism, but we have to look at state-sanctioned violence before that. And as a Christian committed to nonviolence, I abhor all nonviolence. And so I think what happened, and I said very clearly today, that was horrific what happened. But the reality is that there are people who there and here, lives are being lost, children are being killed, and we really need to try to restore our communities. And what that's meant here in Westchester is that Jewish communities have been among the most supportive of Black communities and advocating for restorative justice. And they have been allies of communities of color here in Westchester. But ever since October 7th, that coalition has fallen apart. And so I would say to my Jewish friends, whom I have many, because we work together in these restorative justice communities, that I know you wish Jamaal had said things differently at the beginning, and I wish he had said things differently in the beginning. But you know he supports Israel's right to exist. He's been very clear about that. And in fact, he's now adopted a position that's similar to, I should say Biden has adopted a position that's similar to the position that Jamaal was calling for almost from the very beginning. And even, Senator Schumer, and there are lots of Jewish voices, Senator Bernie Sanders, and frankly, the hundreds, even thousands of young Jewish voices who are calling for a ceasefire. So my plea would be that that if you believe in restorative justice, you should realize that ultimately Jamaal and I think George probably believe the same thing. They want hostages to be returned home. Then they don't want the deaths of children in Palestine to continue. That's children and women and elderly. George won't really say that, but I think if you asked him, he would say that. So what you're voting on, by voting for George on this issue, you're voting really against restorative justice. You're voting for somebody who won't speak out about this appalling reality that's going on in the county of which he is chief executive, and the county that is our home. And we imagine ourselves as progressives throughout the county, but how can we be silent about such an appalling reality? The reality of incarceration in New York State is even more appalling than I just mentioned. So we have this horrific legacy of mass incarceration in this county that we think we are sort of the leading progressive county in the nation. And our county executive has been silent about it. But in contrast, Jamaal talks about these things because Jamaal knows, that rhetoric matters. Now I just want to say a few other things related to George's inaction on things that really matter. He said nothing publicly at least, about the death of Kenneth Chamberlain Sr., who was killed by the White Plains police now 11 years ago, I think, when his emergency alarm went off by mistake. His remarkable son, Kenneth Chamberlain Jr., organizes a vigil every year where people for whom this matters come. Jamaal is often there. I've never seen George there, and I've never heard George say anything about that. Beyond that, I've been active in the local Hastings-on-Hudson Westchester Coalition for Police Reinvention and Reimagination Commission that then Governor Cuomo mandated after the death of George Floyd. And there's a lot of disturbing things in our local police departments about that. But one of the things is that we're joining with other Westchester communities in the Westchester Coalition for Police Reform. We've been encouraging setting up an Office of Police Accountability. And this is not something George can do by himself. The legislature has to do something. But 4 years later, George, on this issue, has not taken the leadership. There's been ping pong back and forth between, executive branch and the legislative branch. But a leader for whom this kind of stuff matters, say something. They'd be out there saying, this is essential. I'm chief executive of this county, and if we want to be a beacon of justice for the rest of our state and the rest of the nation, we have to do something differently here. And so, George really reminds me of one of our, state assembly people, whom I won't mention by name, who's told me point blank, he said, I can either tell the truth or I can get reelected. And I said, you need to be our John Lewis, somebody who talks the truth regardless of the political consequences. And his response was, that's a mighty tall ask. And I think that's the reality with George Latimer. We have a crisis of mass incarceration with racially disparate outcomes on communities of color. And George Latimer has had the political platform to talk about justice, to change the narrative, to tell us what really makes us safe. And he hasn't chosen to do so. And I think by not doing so, he's not just not just failing communities of color in his district, he's failing all of us, because we know only when there's justice is there genuine peace. Only when there's justice for the least of people in our county is there justice for all of us. Our fates are not separate, they are intertwined. And that George has failed us in leading us to a place where we have the kind of justice that matters. Jamaal, I know George says he's all results and no rhetoric, but George's the lack of not having an Office of Police Accountability now, 4 years later, is precisely because of the lack of rhetoric. There's been no vision, no passion, no leadership on this matter. And that's why I think, leaving aside all the other issues, the campaign funding, the structure bill misinformation, and yes, even pulling the fire alarm, leaving aside all those other issues, it seems to me if you have a commitment to restorative justice, a different way of conceiving how we can live together in our world in ways that is fair for everybody, it's essential that we support Jamaal Bowman in this campaign. And I'll also say, since I'm not really a political sort, I'm also say that there's another candidate, and we have a rare situation where we can actually the arc of justice by supporting William Wagstaff III, a civil rights lawyer who's running for Westchester District Attorney. He's come before the impacted communities and talked about things like Jamaal has. And he's willing to speak the truth because it's the truth that matters, and it's the truth that actually can make us all safer and let us all flourish.